Yeah.
I can't.
I didn't see much of it, but I had a completely different impression.
Hold on
Really?
one second. This is the OGM call for Thursday, January 16th, 2025. We're talking about Biden's farewell address. And Gil?
Dave said he seemed doddering. I didn't find that at all. I thought he was coherent, strong, old for sure. But yeah, on top of his game, clear on what he's done, proud of the ceasefire agreement. Yeah, just a very different impression.
Interesting. I'll have to go find the video and see what I think.
And I'll have to
That is
watch the whole
interesting.
thing. I saw a few minutes.
Yeah.
I think a little bit is a question of not is message, how you say it and the way you say it. And you know, I agree with Dave that he did seem doddering, but that didn't put me off at all. And I agree with you, Gil. I think he had some very substantive points to make. And I think it speaks to the subtle issues of ageism that when people are slowing down, you really have to make accommodations to what people are really saying rather than how they're saying it.
Dave, what did you mean by doddering? Could you unpack that a bit?
Well, I mean, to me, it seemed clear that he was reading a speech.
Well, no,
And
they always read speeches.
Yeah.
yeah, and you know, fumbling over his words as he often does.
He's been a stutterer since he was a child.
Yeah.
So, but please unpack it more. What was the doddering?
Well, I would just encourage people to watch themselves and come to their own conclusion. I respect your conclusion, Gil. I mean,
yeah. No, and I respect yours. That's why I want to understand why it seemed that was important, because that's a judgment that's commonly made about him.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can unpack it. It was an impression that I left. I stopped about halfway through it. You know, I wasn't. It didn't seem sincere to me. I mean, I know that he does believe these things, but it just felt like he was reading it and not feeling it to me. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. I mean, age has absolutely crept into Joe Biden's public face and manner and movement. He's definitely looking older, and his attempts to show passion or whatever wind up being masked by his face's not necessarily not necessarily ability to express the things he wants to say. I find his face harder to read as he ages, because his expressions don't show up maybe as they would when he was younger, and that's kind of life. But I find these as lucid as before, but not. But time has left its mark.
Yeah,
his face might be Botox. His face might be Botoxed.
Could I just add a medical perspective to it?
Rick, then Gil.
Sorry.
Yeah, just add a medical perspective. The thought that went through my mind is that when people have early vascular dementia, which he may have, I don't want to even go there, but they can develop what's called Parkinsonism. And so he has more of a mask-like face. And so my concern is that people are interpreting his nonverbal communication more than his verbal communication. And in so doing, they don't hear the message as well as someone who doesn't take that into consideration.
Also, we read everything into nonverbal cues. We are little absorption machines for every last little nuance and hint from everybody all the time. That's kind of how humans are. We're really interested in every slip and problem. So that's kind of a relentless lens on whatever he does. And it's got to have been harder. I was reading in one of the newsletters this morning, might have been Robert Reich or somebody, that he broke his foot early in the administration playing with his dog, and then refused to go to a lot of the physical therapy that would come along with it to give him more mobility in his foot. So as a result, he had more of a pronounced wobble walking and whatever else. And like, I don't know, but anyway, we don't need to spend that much time on him. Go ahead, Dave.
Just to say, in fairness to him, I mean, it's not like I don't watch him very often. So
yeah.
You know, I'm, my impression is more maybe of general. I mean, I think maybe the last time I watched him give a speech was probably the debate, so
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not a kind of, it's not like I watch him as often as I talk to people that I know, or so,
Mhm.
it's just it's pretty casual impression and probably callous now that I'm listening to all of you.
No, that's all right. Impressions matter, unfortunately, more than they should these days. So there we go. I'm interested in catching up with our conversation. I wasn't here last week, Klaus. Thank you for hosting the call. Um, and I'd love to sort of come back into how far we've gotten or where we ended up. Is it possible for us to collectively summarize where we are on maybe symbolic capitalism and its related topics, or did um,
You,
whoever?
you mean you haven't watched the recordings, Jerry?
I've not watched the whole recording, I will confess. But anybody who'd like to sort of bring us there and see where we might head with it today, I appreciate that.
Can I try to just take a little shortcut here for a second?
All shortcuts appreciated, Stacy. Go ahead.
Okay. What's most relevant to me about the part of the call we just had is really not about Biden, but what Rick said about people, about not listening to what they're saying, but listening to how they're saying it. And the way this ties in is because Klaus shared a podcast that was created regarding symbolic capitalism. And what I really loved about that 7-minute podcast is it demonstrated the way people should be having conversations. The artificial podcasters, I don't know what else I want to call them or what we should call them, but the artificial podcasters don't have that problem that we exhibit in terms of shaping the message to the messenger. And I would like to go back to that. I mean, it's only a 7-minute podcast. It's not like too much effort to ask that people listen to it and, jump in with whatever they think, whatever direction we go in. My motivation for the whole topic is not so much about what symbolic capitalism means, but in general, my feeling is the more we recognize our own behavior, the more we share with each other what we are each doing at different times that we maybe don't like so much, but we don't notice it because we've just been doing it forever, the more we can together evolve. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say. You're muted, though.
Thank you. Appreciate it. If anyone can repost the link to that podcast, so we have the right recording at hand, that would be great. Rick.
Yeah, just to echo, Stacy, something you said, but with a different frame, is the whole notion of reflexivity. That's a rabbit hole that we could go down to, which is really looking at yourself and understanding yourself, how it is that you interpret things certain ways. And it's really about enhancing one's self-understanding and self-awareness of how we make interpretations, which we're not well trained in.
Thank you. Anyone else with a summary or help us focus this moment with feedback on where we are?
Yeah,
Thanks, Klaus.
the podcast sort of summarizes the conversation, right? Because I think the critical element here is the trifecta, and that's actually what this is called, the trifecta, meaning that you have the symbolic capitalists and you have the wealthy oligarch class, and then you have people who are blue collar, low on the income scale, who in a surprisingly number voted for Trump. Right? So there was a 15% bump towards Trump in the below $50,000 income groups. And so how is that? Why would people vote beyond be against their own interests? I think that's sort of crystallized it. So now when you have these three segments in the population, you can think about it differently. I mean, I was just scanning the podcast this morning and the LinkedIn conversations. Everybody is wringing their hands about. Hartman wrote a report this morning about how we are copying the Roman Empire, right? The progression of decline. Doug had an article this morning saying the same thing. So everybody is now saying, we are going down as a democracy or republic, and we're moving into an autocracy, and it's a common cycle that just happens over and over. So we know all that stuff, but then there is a significant share of the population who doesn't understand that, and they don't think about this. And even well-educated people don't have time or inclination, really, or the impetus, to think about that stuff. So I think that podcast sort of crystallized this actually in an astounding way. I used AI to stimulate this AI, right? So I summarized the conversation with AI, giving it the instruction to say, give me a summary for the podcast, the LM, a notebook LM, to create this conversation.
And just to be a little more specific about what you did, can you describe, you used Notebook LM as the tool to create the podcast, which is a thing we've seen done. What did you feed it?
No. I used my own GPT.
Oh, okay.
To create the stimulus material for Notebook LM.
Okay. And what did you ask ChatGPT to create?
I asked it to summarize this conversation. I have the entire conversation in a thread, so I keep conversations chaptered, in this way, sort of categorized, and as I summarize this entire conversation, all our findings so far, and develop this stimulus material for Notebook LM.
Cool. And sorry, which conversational thread was that? What conversation did it come from?
That was my conversation with the LM. I mean, with the GPT, which I use to post in the thread, right? So,
okay,
because I engaged in conversations with the AI before I responded, and then so I'm not copy pasting anymore. I'm reinterpreting the conversation to not just post like some AI, but it's the outcome of me having very specific questions, and also the AI doesn't jump around making connections like I do, right? So that's why AI doesn't replace your own way of thinking. That's for sure.
Right.
It just amplifies it. No.
And then in this case, it's amplifying it.
I'm sorry, but to be clear, it included the other contributions by the other people,
Right.
because you were happy. I just want to make that clear.
Sorry, how did those contributions make their way into the thread?
Because I had them in the conversation. So in the conversation, so I'm taking like a conversation from our thread, and I'm coming back to the AI and saying, okay, so here is where the conversation
Klaus,
is drifting.
I'm confused, Klaus. Conversation from which thread? OGM?
From the OGM discussions. Yeah. So like your comments, okay, your comment, I'm taking your comment, putting it in there, and I say, so here's what Gil is thinking. So how do we weave this into our thought process here?
So it's the OGM transcript, extractions by you, interactions with you and your GPT, and all that dropped into the podcast generator. Is that?
I'm not sure it's transcript. Klaus, is Gil's contribution coming from the transcript of a previous OGM call or from the thread on the OGM list?
From the thread on the OGM list, it's direct.
Okay, so it's email. It's the email list. It's not the Zoom call.
Yeah.
Got it.
Thank you. So I think I have the chain clearer now. I really appreciate that, Klaus. Rick.
Yeah, Klaus, I think what you just did was brilliant. And I don't know if you've ever watched a video, a 7-minute video on here might be a way of doing it, whether you decide to or not, it's up to you guys. But what I want to come back to the reflexivity aspect of it, because that's your perspective and your shaping of it, which is great. And so it's going to shape the output. The advantage of going back and critiquing that is to allow everyone to say, well, what was missing from it, or what was not said? Because in that last call, I didn't say anything. I just listened and I just putsied along using AI because, to be quite honest, I wasn't that interested in symbolic capitalism as a construct. I mean, it's got a good upside, which is describing a phenomena. The downside is the author doesn't really give much guidance about how to get out of the conundrum. And as I was searching, I came up with other constructs like social capitalism, and I think I put a link in there. So things that go into what gets included. Did my Perplexity AI get included about social capitalism in comparison to symbolic capitalism? I think this is just the sort of generative dialogue that we need to have about how to co-create human AI synergy. So I take my hats off. I'm going to watch your video because I'd love to critique it.
It's just an audio. It's this podcast.
The
that,
link is in the link is in the chat. Yeah, the link to the audio is in the chat. Klaus pasted it. It's a Google Drive audio file. Cool. So where does this leave us? What would we like to focus our attention on? What are you curious about? What are you interested in this moment?
I'd like to make a statement.
Please, Stacy.
If we are the knowledge workers, it would behoove us to really understand our role. And I love what Klaus did, and I highly recommend we watch, and that's a starting point. And it's not just it's also the things we take in. Like, I want to clarify, and Klaus, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that every article that was presented as part of Klaus's process was fed into his his chat sheet. So it's like there were no articles left out. It's not just Klaus deciding what's relevant. He was taking the work, what other people contributed and discussing it with that. So everything is already included. And the reason I bring that up, well, let me ask a question real quick. Just raise your hand if you had heard about Musa and symbolic capitalism before Dave Gray put it in the thread. Okay.
I think maybe a little bit.
So we're not really sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Now tell me, how many people here have heard of Rich Henderson? One. Interesting.
No, not one. I had to take my hand down.
You have two? Gil?
Have not. My hand was up from a prior thing. So
Okay. I almost don't want to tell you why it's interesting, but Dave, where did you hear of him?
I'm not sure, but I subscribe to his newsletter. I've subscribed to a ton of email newsletters, and I'm not sure where I found it, but I get his newsletter.
Can one of you put a link to his newsletter or to his LinkedIn profile or his Wikipedia page into the chat?
Yeah, I can look for it.
Thanks.
So I want to share an example with you, but I don't want you to think I'm taking this personally. I'm not. I'm using this as an example. So David Gray put in about symbolic capitalism, and a lot of us read about it and engaged in it. I did as well. I put in something about Rich Henderson and luxury values and suggested that it was complementary to this work. And as interested as everybody seems to have been in that thread, nobody even noticed that. And I don't want you to answer for me now, but I would like you to ask yourself, why is it that we paid attention when David Gray put something in, but we didn't pay attention when Stacy Druss put something in? And again, I'm not
Stacey,
taking it personally.
I have to say that nobody paid it. I put something in and nobody paid attention to me either. The only people only started paying attention to it when Gil put it into the
Okay.
email.
Well, that's more but again, that feed, that's more information. That's
Yeah.
the point I'm trying to get to. And again, I don't want to discuss it now, but I think it's important. And it's funny because Gil had said something in 2 calls ago. I wasn't on the last call, and he talked about being curious. And I put in the comments, it depends what you're curious about. And I think it's important that we ask ourselves, since we know that we have, confirmation bias and things like that, as knowledge workers, we need to ask ourselves, where are we showing our curiosity? Where are we cutting it off from? And I think it's especially important in a group like this.
Rick, you've been patient. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to build on what you just said, Stacey, I have a slightly different perspective, more from a systemic perspective about that phenomenon, why Dave and your contributions. I think there is so many opportunities for curiosity. It's difficult to know where to go. And what will happen within groups is that the dominant members of the group will tend to attract more attention, and the marginalized members of the group will not be observed, or they won't even be responded to. And I think that's an issue of equity. And it also depends on how you set up your learning situation that enables that type of inside-out dynamic, which I think is something that I'm working on in terms of trying to develop a neo-learning process that it's far more inclusive and it's iterative, generative over time. Because I find that emails overwhelming, I pop in now and again, it's happenstance as to whether I catch on something, because it's not the only thing that I follow. And so I think one of the things as knowledge workers that we're faced with is that if we're going to overcome our Brownian motion of distraction, we have to learn how to galvanize ourselves in ways that we can deconstruct symbolic capitalism. But not only that, the alt-right propaganda machine, which is running amok and running us into the ground. And I think this is different from, the Roman Empire. They didn't have AI. This is much worse. And if we don't have a counterforce to alt-right propaganda, we're going to be victims of it. And we are victims, and we will be for the next 4 years.
Can I make that correction, Jerry? Real quick.
Please.
So it's Rich Henderson and not Rob Henderson? Or is it Rob Henderson and not Rich Henderson?
So which one? Dave put a Substack in for Rob Henderson.
Luxury values guy.
That's the Rob. It's Rob.
Okay. So I got his name wrong. But the other thing to Rick real quick, what he said and what he said about the alt-right, it's because of everything you explained before that the alt-right was able to leverage that, because they gave a voice to people that weren't being heard. So it's exactly what you described that they used to turn the tables. And that's why it's so important. I'm glad you're working on that, and that's why I brought it up.
Before going to Klaus, I'm these days personally overwhelmed by the number of things I need to read and process and digest, and having a hard time figuring out which to prioritize. Some of these things are long reads and just eat up a whole mess of time, but they seem really important. And I bounce around between them a lot. And then I'm old enough that I have too much email coming in every day, and I try to slash that back by unsubscribing from things, and that is not that successful. So I'm kind of treading water in the info torrent, and not harnessing AI to help me process the info torrent yet, et cetera, et cetera. So in the middle of this, we're trying to have a discussion where we're sharing lots of info and then generating lots of new info and posting things. And I think it's hard to do because we're plopping in fresh into these new contexts and new opinions. I'm not saying this very well, but I'm listening to the quality of our interactions here in OGM, in Open Global Mind, to try to figure out how might we either slow down or visualize or in some other way make more accessible the different points we're making. Because I think that the notion of luxury value, Stacey, is completely connected to symbolic capitalism and performative progressives and elite overproduction. And all these terms are kind of mixed in the porridge of what's happening to explain who's responsible for what, who's paying attention to what, who's insincere and who's sincere, and how politics and power moves forward. it's all in the mix. So I'm a little overwhelmed and would love for us to somehow make this more accessible, at least to us, which might make it more accessible to anybody else who happens to be listening in. Klaus.
Yeah, wrapping it together was actually my intention, because there are a lot of moving parts here. So I think that the idea of symbolic capitalism was not sufficient, right? It's a good base, but it didn't come to life for me until the foreign policy article that added this third element to it, the trifecta, right? And then adding the concept of Karl Marx with alienation and carrying all this forward. So now you all of it, when you look into Substack and across conversations, you all of a sudden see Marx coming into the topic, right? Because there is an understanding that there is such a thing as a working class. There are people who may be highly skilled, but they don't work, with theoretical concepts. And so you have this educated class. So that there are three distinct groups. And the podcast, which for some reason we don't want to listen to, because it's a 6-minute compilation, really does a pretty decent job. I mean, I was surprised how that AI actually captured the essence of the conversation by crystallizing how we alienated, a working class with this woke concept, and how educated people don't even understand their woke. They can't even process the concept, and then how this is being exploited, by people who own the media and the controlling functions of the government. So that is we have to, every once in a while, take a snapshot at where we are. This is what you started out saying. Give me a snapshot, right?
Yep.
My intention was, using an AI that designs to provide snapshots, because that's
Yep.
really Notebook LM is designed to do, to bring it into one concept where, okay, we have a new plateau to stand on, because it's very critical. There are some really critical next steps that come out of this consolidation, where you have to think about how do we communicate with this working class, because the way we're doing it right now obviously doesn't work. But the group that manipulates this working class is very effective and relentless, right? In sowing this division and separating the, if you call it thinking class, the educated class, from that group, so we have become completely ineffective.
Klaus, thank you for that. And I'm sort of only just catching up to your intentions and how that worked. Stacy, I think you were trying to invite us all to listen to the 7-minute audio here together in this call, which you didn't say explicitly, but I think that was your invitation, or no?
No, I had actually, there's another email regarded to NeoBooks where that's sort of there.
Yes.
But yeah, I think it's a great idea to do it. I mean, yes.
Yeah, and I'm
Uh,
unclear about listening to a podcast here
yeah, I
together.
didn't.
I'm not sure the dynamics work really well on a group Zoom call,
Yeah.
but I'm interested in as many of us as can listening to it, maybe for the next call. Although if everybody wants to listen to it, I will I'll play it and share it here. But I'm curious about how that works. But so thank you, Klaus, for proposing that snapshot and creating one and sharing it with us. Doug.
So I want to loop back to an orthogonal piece in the middle of all this, which is in the flood tide of incoming. There is also a spectrum of individual affinity for different channels and modalities of communication. and I think somebody else mentioned in the chat, that the thread, the OGM thread, is a modality that I also find challenging. So I'm not resonant with that. I don't go there. I get the emails outputs from it, but there's also a level of pixelation and discontinuity in my experience of that, because I'm not consistently following it, which if I was in the thread, I would have more of a coherent sense of the flow and the contribution
When you,
aggregation.
Doug, when you say the email summaries, are you on digest mode? So you get a weekly summary? Is that what you mean, or something else?
No, well, I get emails that I think are triggered by entries into the thread, into the OGM thread.
I
And
don't know what trigger you're using to get selected messages from the OGM. And you mean the Google group, the mailing list?
um,
Or do you mean the Mattermost, where we don't talk very
I,
much? We've
I,
tried to move the conversation over to Mattermost. That hasn't worked very well.
yeah, I think probably it's an output of the Google list.
I get digests from the Google list, but it's not weekly. It's as far as I can tell, it's random, sometimes daily, sometimes every couple of days with
Yeah,
one
that's
to 12 emails in it.
yeah, that's my experience as well.
Okay, so you're getting the digest.
So I'm getting the digest.
Cool.
But I'm not a player, participant, contributor in the digest, right? I'm not really playing in that thread, however it's generated. I'm not even sure I would, know how to go to source to make a contribution or respond. And pretty much exclusively, my OGM contribution is in these live sessions, which is where I experience the greatest pull, because it's synchronous, it's in connection, it's present moment, all of the ingredients that make it live, make it coherent, and make it easy for me to grasp and follow. So depending upon, so there's an intrinsic bias, and when Klaus described how he applied AI and generated what he generated, so if he wasn't using the transcripts of the live sessions, I'm invisible. Stacy raised the idea that her contribution at one point, whatever the modality and context in which it was contributed, she felt invisible. And so circling, full circle back around to, if we work from the human capacity backwards, rather than from the technology affordances and proliferation of channels and tools and modalities and all the rest, if we started with, what can a human being, how best can a human being be in connection with others? How can a group service each individual human being in maximizing the connectivity and sharing by and between? I think there may be stuff there that informs or modifies the way in which a group like this does what it does, how many channels it proliferates or doesn't, and for what reasons, in terms of how it's serving the group connection, coherence, shared understanding, comprehension, all of that. So it's sort of like, crazy making. And the faster the wheel spins, the harder it is to make any sense out of anything, much less keep up, much less find coherence. And at a certain point, do you say, okay, stop, I want to get off the merry-go-round. Let's start from a still place. Let's start from a us place and do an evaluation of what's needed. And I'm complete with that.
Thanks for that. Gil.
Yeah, Doug, thanks for that very much, both for what you said and for the mood and energy with which you've said it. I feel a bit settled here. I've been frustrated with this conversation for the last 30 minutes and very frustrated with it more recently. It's the strangest one we've ever had in my experience. Um, I also am very inconsistent in how I deal with the Google Groups thread. The data on my participation or lack thereof contains precisely no information about what I'm interested in, care about, value, appreciate, or anything like that. It's entirely too random. Jerry, you said there's so much stuff that you have to follow. I would question the have to follow formulation. We're all sucked into this addiction with this stuff, and it's like, yeah, the hamster wheel, exactly right. And so I attempt to valve that very inconsistently. The technology of the Google Digest and the Google group on web is really clunky for me, so I don't do it well. Um, um, and so I'm occasionally moved by something in the digest to go look. But the layers of what it takes to respond to something is frustrating for me. So I'm inconsistent there. Um, um, so there's a lot of assessments being made about motivation here that I think are not grounded. Klaus, you said people don't want to listen to the podcast, and I don't want to not listen to the podcast. I actually do want to listen to the podcast. I didn't know about the podcast. So
I didn't say that, Gil. I mean, I suggested listening to the
no,
podcast.
I got, you can check, go back to the videotape. I got you quoted a few minutes ago saying people don't want to listen to the podcast.
Oh, okay.
And there's no
I think
doubt
he meant on the call, and I think he was referring to Jerry's direction.
whatever, but there was, yeah. Thank you, Stacy. I didn't say I don't want to listen to it. I don't think anybody said we don't want to listen to it until Jerry asked, and several of us said we did. I didn't know about the podcast until now, so my not listening to it conveys no information. That's what I'm trying to say. We're jumping to assessments about people's motives, and I would assert, just for the record, that nobody ever knows a fucking thing about anybody else's motives, but we live as though we do. And that's one of the problems in the universe of human beings. So let's be gentle and careful and compassionate about that. We can ask people about their motives, but that always doesn't get you the right answer anyway. So, this is messy territory. Um, um, so I'm concerned that there's layers of remove in this conversation. That's one of them. Klaus, I'm intrigued by what you did. I want to hear what you did, but an AI trained on your conversation with an AI about a thread in the Google groups about conversations in the OGM calls is a whole lot of layers of remove and abstraction. And echoes for me, one of the concerns I have about AI is that as the volume of AI production increases, we're going to be increasingly dealing with AIs trained on AI output. Not AIs trained on human output, but AIs trained on AI output about human output. And it's going to get really, really weird. And I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about the little model of it that we have here. With regard to this symbolic capitalism thing, I was interested in it. I don't know if Dave or I posted it first, doesn't matter. But thank you, Dave, if you did. I read it not as a criticism of like, oh, you symbolic capitalists are bad, get your shit together, but as a descriptive observation that there's this phenomenon happening that's different than what we've understood before. I mean, Marx comes up here. Marx is not about rich or poor. Working class does not mean low income. Marx is about class as relationship to the means of production. And you either own the means of production and employ people and pay them wages and take surplus value from them as a capitalist, or you are working class, which means you sell your labor power, usually for time, sometimes for pieces. And so what the symbolic capitalism frame is saying is that we are in a different relationship to the means of production. We are not, a lot of people here are not wage laborers, but are entrepreneurs that control that own tools, that have access to tools that produce stuff that other people maybe buy or don't. And so I saw this provocative reframing, and I think the criticism that's implied in that thing is that we're not very good at it. We're not very conscious of it. We're not very good at it. Um, Somebody said something, who said something about, oh, Stacy, you said about the alt-right giving voice to the working class. I have a different assessment of that. First of all, I don't know what alt-right means, but if you mean, Bannon and Murdoch and so forth, I wouldn't call it that alt-right. I would call it the communications forces of fascism. But we can talk about that another time. Yeah, they gave voice to working class frustration, by the way, which was not, the frustration was not out of wokeness. It's out of like flat incomes for the last 40 years while accumulation of wealth has grown and other things like that. Woke is a sideshow, in my opinion. But if you go back to 2016 and look at the Bernie Sanders campaign, he resonated with working class powerfully. He and Trump both did. They both spoke to the disaffection. They both understood it in ways that the mainstream on Republican and Democrats didn't. Um, 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 Bernie was largely blacked out by the mainstream media till fairly late in the campaign. You can go back and look at the data and see that. The access wasn't there despite massive rallies around the country. And despite that, he pulled 44% of the primary vote, despite blackouts. So there was a resonance there, and there was somebody on the left resonating with working class. So I think it's really important to understand that stuff. And, back to the topic at hand, there's a hypothesis that people like us are symbolic capitalists. There's an assessment that we don't understand it, we're not doing it well. And I think the provocation, at least mine and maybe Dave's yours too, was what can we understand about that and embrace that role and use it more effectively? Because we see all around us, we've lost this war for the moment. I don't know if you watched the hearings yesterday, the confirmation hearings, it's disastrous, ugly, dangerous. I felt the sense of not just like upset, but defeat. And there's going to be consequences for years to come from the failures of the last few years. So that's enough.
That was a lot of stuff, Gil. Thank you.
So I'm sorry for going on so long.
I just want to put a couple things in before going to Sam and Kevin. Yeah, I'm resonating with your frustrations, and I would love somehow to magically tap into everybody's frustrations on the call about OGM, not necessarily about the world situation, because that would like fill a bathtub really fast. But I just want to name a couple here. This question of, what do I have to read that you mentioned, Gil? It's kind of like, well, do I want to be a good moderator of a conversation that I helped create? Well, I should probably pay attention to as many of the things that people are putting in the conversation as I can. And that's overwhelming in comparison and connected to all the other stuff that shows up in the world with which I feed myself and that I feed back into our conversations. So that's a frustration. You pointed to Klaus's many layers of the analysis he did in the summary he gave us in podcast form. And I'm a little frustrated by the layers, but I don't want to dissuade anyone from attempting a synthesis using power tools. I want to encourage Klaus to do that and to describe to us what the layers were so that we can understand what might have happened in between, which is, Klaus, why I was asking you what fed what to create the podcast that you shared with us. But I'm frustrated because I want more of us to try to get to synthesis and share it out with us in different ways. I think that's hugely important for what we're trying to do here. And then a tiny thing, but I'm frustrated that whenever the word class comes up, Marx comes up first. And I think Marxist class analysis is not helpful half the time. And I'm really interested in other forms of class analysis, including caste and the other sorts of things that we've talked about on this list. And a part of me wants to spend a half day just dissecting class analyses of class and which ones are useful and not useful and how they hijack us, because the moment Marx is mentioned, there's a hijacking of the brain that I think happens in a lot of conversations. And a bunch of people who are like, oh yeah, we're going to talk about communism now, and they check out without realizing how deep Marx was, whatever else is going on. But that's a frustration I have as well. And that little frustration is one stone in the pond rippling out, and there are so many issues like that here in this in the field of conversation that we're in. You know, if we start with a big rock dropped in called symbolic capitalism, and then all these other things are kind of around it, we're doing a pretty messy job, but a nice job of kicking through the issues and figuring out how we feel and what's going on. Anyway, wanted to drop those things in. Sam, are you local? I see only the back of your chair. You have your hand up, but I think I'm going to go to Kevin if you don't show up. But Sam, whenever you show up, you'll have the floor.
Hey.
Hey, Kevin, how's it going?
Okay, really well. You know, I had an epiphany, oddly enough, when I was talking to Klaus, which is like, okay, you know, usually with Klaus, you get the big plan of what he's doing and he's turned it into something and then you have to read it. But I was talking about how there is, and that's no criticism, that's just how it works. And I read you on LinkedIn, I pay attention, okay? And but what was odd was that, you know, I was talking about all the new things that are possible post disaster here, and Klaus said it's terrible that it had to be a disaster to make that happen. And as I was reading, I've been reading all the books on disaster and system change. You know, Solnit is actually the foundational piece, but there's several others going back to the bomb that exploded in Halifax in like 1904 or whatever. The sociology of disasters, and you can build back something totally different after a disaster, like in Argentina they did with the co-ops when they got canceled by the World Bank. And so, and he was saying it's sad that it had to be a disaster. I think without a disaster, things aren't broken enough that you will make these drastic changes. We are building back new things. Like, let me give one example. World Central Kitchen, everybody loves them, right? They're in LA. Well, actually, they're terrible in so many ways because they buy from Costco and they don't buy from local producers. And so local farm to market folks were sidelined completely by this wonderful nonprofit that buys from bulk. And so we've got a grant. The Red Cross has been really interested in new system change. And so they're giving a grant to our local Mother Earth Foods, which is a local food distributor, to buy from them and tee up what the local inventory would be that could be a model that's replicated in disasters. So it's, you know, if you don't, World Central Kitchen would have to buy local, right, to get the philanthropic money that it does. And so there's lots of other things like that where we're just changing the nature of, you know, we're adding little linkages of reciprocity, because there was this thing that happened that is these evanescent utopias. And so if you build in pieces of infrastructure that emulate that around reciprocity, around building an economy where you care for your neighbor and you don't commodify either your neighbor or nature, people like it better. And actually you're restoring property values more because our rivers got scoured, and we're going to have to work with the Eastern Band Cherokee on river cane as the best filter to bring the river back. And they don't have enough supply because these are the folks that hid from Andrew Jackson up in the hills, so they don't own bottom land. And so they don't have enough supply for their double weave baskets that can hold water that have been sold for $2,000. So, so many things are, we're willing to say, wait, we have to build back distribution. Oh, let's build distribution where the benevolent nonprofit that is actually abusive to the local farm to table food produce, you know, our local growers isn't abusive to our growers, right? And so the disaster is the opportunity, and you can't change a system. You get all these well-meaning people saying, how do you get people to change? Well, when the shit's broken, you can build something new, and that's what we're finding, and it's a huge opportunity. So that's it.
Kevin, thank you. And this idea of opportunities coming out of disaster, I think, is going to come in really handy for the next couple decades. So it's a
So
good.
if I could do one other thing we're doing, there's a group that's doing mutual insurance. They've raised $5 million to do pilots in 5 cities. because insurance is not going to work as a for-profit thing in these places, right? And it's not invest in a startup, it's invest in, there's a pony in there somewhere. And so it's one of these, high failure is okay. In fact, even if all failed, but you found little parts that you could make a hot rod with, it would be great. And because we're sort of well known for building all these new things, we've got a great national permaculture folks who've gotten a grant to do climate risk analysis in a place. And so they want to do it here, and that will be the risk analysis to say what's the cost of risk, which is the first thing you have to do to self-insure, right? So they're going to look at the culverts, and they're going to look at the zoning, and they're going to look at everything else, everything else. I mean, they can't stop you from making mesh networks. They can stop you from solar farms. Duke owns the right to connect property through networks on solar. Duke is incredibly confiscatory. It's a terrible utility. We're going to participate in a suit against them that somebody said, but I'm hoping that they try to buy us out by saying you can do solar farms here if you don't participate, because Swannanoa is super well known now. Our governor came and spent an hour and a half with Swannanoa Grassroots Alliance, and he brought his staff, because we are the most visible way devastation happens. There's some towns that have been washed out and you can't really see it. With Swannanoa, you experience it, you're in the midst of it, it's overwhelming. And so people come to see it. That Trump guy came into the thing. We've been on the front page of the New York Times 5 times. We've been on the Washington Post a couple times. The BBC is here. Our devastation is the best picture of the devastation of Helene. Helene was the thing that happened before LA, if you remember that. So anyway, we could build new things because of the disaster that we would never have built without the disaster.
Kevin, thank you. That's a whole lot of things, and I'm in a different conversation with a different group about resilience in the Pacific, and we're going to be talking to Marshall Islanders soon, who are trying to respond to climate change. There's a whole bunch of islands in the Pacific that are going to be underwater soon that have very different cultural attitudes about what to do and whom to trust, and those things are kind of bubbling in a different conversation in parallel here. But thanks for putting that in the conversation, Kevin. Klaus.
Yeah, Kevin just reminded me that the same conversation that is on this podcast we don't want to listen to is also in my newsletter. And so it's easier to read for some, but what it basically is saying that we are heading towards a disaster because the Trump administration, the election campaign of Trump, boosted by Elon Musk, made a whole bunch of promises to a whole bunch of people which they have no intention of keeping. And that is going to lead towards a problem which will lead to the familiar cycle of news media putting a flashlight on, here's what was promised, here's what's not happening. We will lead towards media suppression. So you have all these, and this is what actually Hartman is now focusing on, is these familiar cycles where power has been concentrated now in a group of people who really cannot deliver to the proverbial working class what they have promised to deliver on. Now, and that will set off a whole cataclysm, of conflict, in the media. So my key point here is that if we are the symbolic class, right, which has been discredited, maybe rightfully so, as being woke and focusing on issues that are really not relevant to a person who is on food stamps and trying to pay the electric bill before the power gets cut off, and so constantly balancing 2 jobs and a child and how to survive, and so the symbolic class, which is the whole argument, has alienated itself from people who really do need help and who really do focus on bread and butter issues. That's basically, the entire concept of what the We Are Not Woke book is trying to explain. So the question is, so I'm done with this, right? I mean, we have exhausted this conversation. The question then is, so what do you do with it? I mean, now that we have a better understanding of what is understood by woke, and that we may indeed be woke ourselves, focused on climate change and on a environmental issue, moral issues, and so on and so on, that are meaningless to a person who is hungry, right? I mean, who can't get food to their kids. So where do we go next? I mean, how do we change our communication? How do we intercept this communication to this group that has voted for Trump against their own interest? How can we make an impact? That's where I'm going with this.
Sam, thank you for returning to your seat. I passed you a little earlier, and when you were missing, I'll go right to you.
Yeah, and I apologize.
Let me poke at something Klaus just said, and then go back to you.
Sure, sure.
Okay. So Klaus, there's an assumption in what you just said and posted that I just want to examine, which is, will they really not be able to do what they promised or threatened? Will the incoming MAGAs not be able to do? And there are some threats and promises which is sort of mixed, that are clearly impossible or poorly understood or whatever. But it may also be that we're understanding wrong how they're intended, that they're merely threats, not something they want to carry out. But I think there's a very complex system of issues in how Trump and MAGAs have been presenting what they want to do that we dismiss out of hand by saying these things are impossible. Why are people voting against their interests? I think people voted their interests in some way, and I don't think they're all idiots. I think that our understanding of those interests and how policy issues might affect those interests may not be deep enough or clear enough to figure out what their logics are, but they're not being completely unreasonable and logical. They're seeing that the current system isn't working for them, I think. So I'm leery of saying that the entire far right's program is impossible and could never deliver anything that the people who voted for them want, and therefore can be dismissed. Which I'm overgeneralizing here. I'm overstating what you said, but I heard that in what you were saying, and I'm very cautious about adopting an attitude like that.
So that's actually why we should be listening to this podcast, because it's explained in there, right? Because that's
Cool.
that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that they have made promises they have no intention of keeping. So, for example, Trump is talking on the one hand about benefiting, supporting social services, and assisting, people getting a better living. At the same time, he has already promised to cut social services, to cut food stamps, to cut social security and all these programs. So he has already demonstrated that he has no intention of keeping promises he has made. And when that materializes, right, when the budget discussions come up, and we need to cut social security and we need to cut food stamps, where 42 million people in America are dependent on food stamps. We spend $182 billion a year in nutritional assistance programs at this point. So when these cuts are coming, then you will see, that there is a conflict emerging, which will create this crisis that Kevin was just talking about.
Thank you. These are crusty, difficult issues. Sam, first to you. You're muted, however.
Hi, everybody.
Yo.
Yeah, I'm listening as I putter around, but I'm about to go cook dinner. But I just wanted to say hi, and good to see you all, and see you next time, I guess.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Sam. Mark.
Sorry to be late. The topic of this conversation is symbolic capitalism.
We started with a summary or a reset or a recap of what had happened in the last couple calls and online and so forth, and it's been complicated and interesting.
It is complicated. Um, you know, I'm hearing understanding before action. Certainly, that makes a good deal of sense. And, certainly there are different, I guess, ways that people tend to either understand or act. Um, if we look at, say, um, a MAGA kind of, it's act first and then, you know, use whatever rhetoric one can test in the market to see if the rhetoric works or not. And, you know, just, we have no intention of keeping our promises. We have some intention of keeping our threats. Um, Certainly, this is a very human pattern going back before the Romans, before the Greeks. Um, you look at Roman politics, you look at English politics, you look at Indian politics. I mean, this is what can we get away with as opposed to let's all work together. And like, say, Gil, or maybe others, I really don't know the answer. Klaus, I haven't heard about your newsletter, or maybe I have, and it's just, where do I find it? Is it worth my time? Now, I don't mean to be unkind. I'm on food stamps. Um, I'm not sure where, how I'm going to make a living. Now, I'm not representing myself as everybody on food stamps, certainly not. But I come to this forum and I'm asking myself, what am I seeking here? Certainly, there are good people. I certainly appreciate, Klaus, what you're doing with soil, and Ken and Doug and Gil, everybody. But what can I do to focus on those hierarchy of needs? Certainly, when I'm starving, I'm gonna go for food, and I'm not gonna think about um, rhetorical tricks in mass communication. It's just kind of, how it goes. Um, and it is complex. Um, I'm not sure that raising my hand and say, I don't know, is useful for this group. But I do want to point out these things are, the things that we're saying are old in history. Destroy the state and put up something new. Talk about a revolution. Oh, you know what it, you know, it's easy to see. And Kevin, as a systems guy, as a software guy, when you were saying things, I was really thrilled, and I'm also really conscious that nothing new ever works. Which is not altogether true, but it's, new is different. Different is scary, and there's unknowns, and I really appreciate the spirit of, yes, we with this we can change. And I've got family in burned areas, um, or maybe areas about to burn. So thank you for listening. I come to this place because it's thoughtful. And I thank Jerry, thank Eric, thank you all. Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, Ken.
Mark, thank you for your thoughtful thoughts on this conversation. Are coming at it. I appreciate it. Mr. Jones.
Yeah, I think what I love about this issue is that you will talk to the people in the room. And I think this call got off track because you also had to talk and relate to something only some people had read. And you had to, it weighted the call toward a resource that wasn't in the room. And I think there's a protocol there that should not be followed again. We should talk about what we are going to talk about and not say you should read what I've written, let me defend what I've written, let me explain what I've written. All of that is a distortion of the protocol of what this call should be about to me. It should be about what you can talk about in this room. And you shouldn't bring in a podcast that you need to listen to and a thing I've written that you need to, that is having too much weight. That's kind of like a lender who adds usury. There is an extra payment that you need to make to Klaus in order to pay attention to the conversation. And I think that's not the way this call should go. I'm sure I love what Klaus writes, but we shouldn't have to do what we were asked to do. I think it makes this call much less interesting and fun. And there's a power around it that I don't like and don't want to be part of.
So Kevin, give me 1 second, Stacey.
Okay.
So I was wrestling with saying, hey, let's ask as many people as can to listen to the 6-minute podcast, and we'll talk about it next week, or actually playing it here so that we had it all as common background. And then maybe stopping it during, which would have taken probably the rest of the call, or whatever else. Kevin, are you trying to say that no article, podcast, or other outside material should be referred to? Because the radical version of what you just said is like, hey, I won't do any homework, and nobody should point to any other resource.
That's obviously a distortion and had nothing to do with what I said. You
Did anybody
completely
else
got it wrong. There was a requirement that you had to keep going back to this article, and then you had to explain that article, and it made Klaus's voice stronger off stage, and he became the chorus, and it didn't work. It was a real violation of what should happen.
I'm unclear that there was a violation. I think we were just struggling with how to deal with the medium, and I just posed to you the dilemma I faced early in the call, which was, hey, do we just skip it to the next call so we might have a chance to listen to it?
I think that's a much better idea than what happened.
Okay. That's fine. I can deal with that. Stacey, thank you. Thanks for being patient.
Sure. Kevin, you came on the call late, so I just want to explain that there was a 6-minute podcast created, which is actually something that in another group I had asked for somebody to do, and Klaus said, I already did that. Here, Stacey, here it is. So I brought it up here to explain that in this one particular instance, where a conversation that there was engagement around with the regulars, some of the regulars. I mean, I usually don't interact on the OGM thread either. In this particular case, I did because one, there were the people that I know on this call, and two is I saw it as an opportunity to do what I'm always trying to do, which is to bring the focus back onto us. So I brought up that podcast as an example of something that now that it's been created is really a perfect starting point for us to engage in the kind of conversations we keep saying we want to help other people engage in.
And so I missed the orientation. So, that's why I came in saying, what the hell's going on in the room and why is it like this? So, okay, I see that.
I'm glad because I think there are even people in this room that didn't get that as well. So I'm glad to be able to respond to you to really make that clear and also take some of the pressure off of Klaus because he was just being helpful to me.
Thank you for responding, Klaus. I see that you were asked to do that. Okay, it's just coming in late. It's like, no, I want to see and hear from the people here, not have to go do my research to be on the call, to be in the conversation. It's just like, I can't go, there are classes that I really failed at in school. And this was like one of those.
This has been an odd call. And if you dropped into this call late, it was really hard to summarize and catch you up to what had happened before you got here. It was like pretty challenging.
Yeah, I see that. So, okay. Well,
Another
Stacy, go ahead.
thing, yeah, another thing that I wanted to say that would be interesting is I would like to personally, and you could do it with me privately if you want, I would like to hear from each and every person about what their frustration was, if they even had a frustration. I didn't have any frustration. Well, I mean, tension, but not
None?
I thought this was a very productive call. I think we came out with a better understanding. I think there were, I don't know.
well, you asked me to build the product that was built, so yeah, of course you're happy. You were the customer.
No. I'm not talking. I'm talking about the whole, even before you came on the call, Kevin. So
But
this
what
is
he did was in response to your request. So
No.
obviously,
I'm not talking
okay.
about that. What I'm talking about is the beginning of the call. I brought up something as a way I thought I was connecting in different pieces that were brought up by people on this call. Rick had said something, I had something on my mind. I used this 6-minute podcast as an example of a starting point. Different people responded to that differently, some in the way that you responded coming on late. I find the
Okay.
whole dynamic, I find the emotional dynamics that went on here worthy of looking at. Maybe not for
Yes.
everybody, because we don't all think with that emotional mindset. So it's not a conversation for everyone, which is also when Jerry, when you said to me, should we listen to it right now? I would have been happy to, but what I said to you is, oh, I wanted to do that on the NeoBooks call. And that is only because I know the people that are there. I know the conversations that we've had, and it made more sense.
Mm-hmm.
In retrospect, we should have just listened to the 6 minutes in the beginning and started the call.
Maybe we should rewind time and just have a do-over. We'll take a mulligan on this call and just start from the top.
No, but we learned so much.
It's true. I like it. And thanks for characterizing the call the way you just did, Stacy, because for me it's been fascinating. It's a funny, janky call, but it's really it's
Life.
very much about who we are and what we're trying to deal with. So yeah, it's life. Thank you, Mr. Carranza.
I study communication, I study meaning, I study semiotics. And to me, the more and more I know, of course, the less I know, but what does seem to be circling around a focus, a critical, is communication is really, really hard. And people who can communicate things in a very simple and powerful emotional way bulldoze subtlety. Just completely, when you get into any kind of statistical arena, either mass communication or voting. And it's worrisome. I mean, I don't know, I respect the intellect of everybody here. And, brilliant. Doug, Ken, Eric, Jerry, Ed, everyone. And almost all the people who come into this forum, if not completely, I don't think there's anybody I disrespect in this forum that's been here. But it's difficult. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Thanks. Go, Ken.
So it's clear I understood not at all what was going on, and as I reacted, it felt like other things that I've been in, where somebody knew lots of protocols and I was the entrepreneur trying to be processed, and it just didn't like it at all. But I see what was going on. I have to leave to go. We have a newsletter to get out and I have to edit it. So I get it. I'm sorry that it rubbed me the wrong way, but anyway, I see what was being attempted. And so anyway, I still think it was off kilter but that's just how that kind of thing appeals to me or not. So if I'd been in on the beginning of it, I might have said, let's build it, but as it was like, you have to come into this built space. Well, who said? I thought this was this open space, open global mind. No, it was down the hallway, open global mind, and you needed to be in room 13. If you didn't know where room 13 was, it didn't work. That was my experience of it. But again, that was the story I built up around it, and it wasn't what the story actually was. And I got to go because they're telling me I got to go work. So anyway, thank you so much. There you go.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks. Yeah, if I weren't already working on the event, I would have been on time, Gil. I actually have a job to do, and I got it free for a few minutes. So, that's just how it is.
Totally get
This
that,
is
Kevin.
not where I clock in.
Totally get that. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that stuff happens at the beginning that happens at the beginning. It's just what it
Yeah,
is.
well, and typically there's not like people aren't working on building a ship in a bottle on these calls.
Enough. True enough. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, then. We have 13 minutes left in our normally assigned time together. We could
I
go.
wonder if Ken has a really long poem to read.
Yeah. Ken, do you want to read like an epic ode of some sort? Do you want to?
Well, I could walk across the room and get Bucky Thor's untitled epic poem on the history of civilization, but I think that might go a little bit over 13 minutes. So I'll just wait. I have a longer poem today, but not 13 minutes worth.
Cool. I think a little meta reflection on where we've been and what we'd like to do with this would be helpful. So anybody who wants to talk about that. I'm also, as I said earlier, and as Stacy echoed, really interested in our frustrations. I think they're each different, and I think this is a moment. So as far as I can tell, in a couple days, on Monday precisely, Martin Luther King Day, ironically, 47 will be inaugurated and will have the full powers that he's already acting as if he's got, and that has to be provoking some frustrations as well. Mr. Breitbart.
So fear is a really powerful thing. And sorry, I just got a weird auto lower hand. Fear is a really powerful thing. And in subtle form, it can be disorientation in relation to the present moment because I don't know what's going on. Kevin shared. I'm not part of the club. And it can be, 24/7, 100%, volume set at 12, hate and vitriol directed at other, which is the administration about to take office. And human beings are really finely tuned, sensitive creatures. And when we're in some state of balance with others, and there is safety, and there is space, and there's room and opportunity for people to listen to each other, hear each other, inquire into each other, all of that good stuff. Anything and everything is possible, is tackleable, is solvable, is creatable. If we're in turbulence as a steady state, almost nothing's possible. And I think, today's session just sort of speaks to we're not immune from being in turbulence. And the, half of the population that's got sucked into voting for Trump are not immune from being sucked into turbulence and attempting to make decisions out of turbulence and fear and chaos and whatever. The only thing I know that proactively suggests or maps to doing it differently is focusing on connection, is focusing on what's needed to make connection, not what's the basis for division, but where do I find the commonality that enables between me and other, safety and openness and listening and connection. And I really think that's sort of like we as a group, as endowed as we are across all the ways in which we are in as good a position as anybody to tackle that question in terms of how do we reach out and connect? What are the commonalities and basis for connecting with, quote, the other side? And opening up channels energetically, emotional channels, connection channels, energetic channels that enable possibility to blossom. Because right now, if we stay polarized or we stay with our languaging and our othering, there's no possibility of a change. And with that, I'm complete, and unfortunately, I've got to hop. But thank you all.
Thanks for that, Doug. And I believe it was Eric who put only connect into the chat at the very top of the call.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that saying from Howard's End is one of my favorite old sayings from literature. And I think if I were to title this episode, in retrospect, I might call it Only Connect, because it's also about the frustrations of not quite connecting and all of that, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Thanks, Doug. And
Thank you,
Only
Doug.
Connect.
Oh, Doug's gone. Ah,
He just had to go. I'm sorry. Did you what you wanted to say was for Doug?
yeah, basically,
Damn it.
that's what I'm asking. Why am I afraid to call Klaus and say, Klaus, I'm a software developer, kind of have some disabilities, but you were talking about some work, and where's my fear in not calling Klaus? Now, I could call Eric, I could call Gil, I could call Stacy, I could call Jerry, Ken, and hey, that's it. I'm complete.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone with some thoughts about moving forward, what you're passionate about talking about in the next few OGM calls? It can be informed by today's call or not. Just a little brainstorming for planning some calls coming up.
I would like to have us explore the opportunity in the crisis as opposed to the danger. There's so much focus on the danger. Like, oh my God, class war, this, that, like, look what they're doing. And they are doing that, not to ignore it, not to downplay it. But on the other side of things, there are opportunities in all of this. And what are the opportunities that we can identify, and how can we develop effective strategies to actualize those opportunities would be of great interest to me.
As it would to me. I love that idea, Ken. Thank you. Klaus?
Yeah, I actually was clapping to what Ken was just saying, but I totally agree. To provide opportunity or an understanding of opportunity, because there is so much, and that's particularly in the area of community development. Really assisting ground level. And of course, in the food system, there's ample opportunity of that, to develop a localized food system to make sure people have food to eat, have employment opportunities within a bottom-up based economy. There's so much of that, Yeah, and it's positive and it's helpful and it focuses people on doing good.
So I think as I listen to Kevin, what I hear is when everything gets stripped away, we come down to what's basic in human nature. And what's basic in human nature is we want to help each other. People help each other when they're in need. And that would be a very powerful thing for us to look at of where do we want to help and who needs help. Um, you know, there's been lots of studies. I'm thinking of the 89 earthquake in San Francisco, gang members going out and helping out, right? People, when there's a disaster, people turn to each other and help. It's the natural thing. So, how do we actualize that? How do we, it's part of an immune system response. Yes, there's a pathology in our collective political body. What's the immune response that will expel that? And I believe it comes from turning to each other and helping each other and saying, wow, you seem to be having a hard time here. What can we do to help? And it's not going to come through the political mechanism of large scale stuff, but it's going to come through local resilient communities. And so what do we need to do to, guilt, take care of each other? What do we do to take care of each other? What do we do to support each other? Mutual aid. Um, in Bruno Latour's Down to Earth, he talks about the fact that the billionaire elites have decided they're going to hog all the wealth and screw the rest of y'all, right? There's not enough planet to go around. We're gonna take this, and the shredding of the social safety net, the denial of climate change, and the explosion of inequality are all part of the exact same phenomena of this denial. He calls it epistemological delirium. We have a huge, well-funded program that says, no, 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 don't worry about climate. We have energy secretary nominees saying the fires are not fueled by climate change. That's bullshit. Like LA is burning. When's this ever happened before, right? Um, and that leads to people not knowing what the hell to believe. And flooding the zone with shit will lead to epistemological delirium. What is the way out of it? You can't fight it. The Brandolini's law says you cannot fight that level of bullshit. It'd be way too much freaking work. So how do you determine and connect people to what is important as opposed to the propaganda that's coming into their field? That's a really interesting question to me to explore.
Yeah.
Gil.
You need to unmute.
Yep.
Thank you. Really well said, Ken. Thank you very much for that. We might want to explore that in Living Between Worlds also as a focus for a call. So thank you for that. The epistemological delirium is a powerful phrase. The flooding the zone with shit, please remember, that's explicit Bannon's strategy underlying the last 10 years of these folks' work. It's intentional. It produces distraction. It's designed to produce among the likes of us in the Democrat establishment and so forth, a sputtering apoplexy of like, oh my God, do you believe what they just said? How could they be so stupid? How could they be so awful? They're lying so much, all of which is time spent away from doing the work of taking care of each other and building the new inside the old and doing the kind of stuff that Kevin is talking about in Swannanoa. I bet those folks there aren't spending a lot of time watching news reports about what Trump said, but they're doing the work of fixing their community. And I just want to underscore the thing that I said about help and taking care. A parent doesn't help their child. I mean, there's times when they help there, but their basic relationship is not helping. The basic relationship is taking care. And that may be, Ken, to your point, said in slightly different words, that may be one of the most fundamental things about being human or about being a mammal, is that we do that. So how do we do that in this moment? Thank you.
Thanks, Gil. Klaus, you may have the last word before our poem.
Yeah, that was actually also the gist of where I was trying to go. By segregating the influence factors within society, coming to the conclusion that this has to be a bottom-up, community-based effort to engage. And what we can do is hopefully cut through some of the bullshit that is swirling and distracting, and just refocus on the basics, that are important within the community. I mean, there are 42 million people in the US who are on food stamps. And there is I mean, there are tens of millions of people who are really struggling. And so how can you engage with that? Now it's multi-level. You know, there are political levels, like within the Sierra Club, where we're going through these same conversations, trying to figure out what's our position. You know, what can we realistically impact? Where can we realistically make a difference? And it's probably not trying to lobby Congress, right? I mean, that's just a waste of time. But how can you communicate with farmers and assist farmers to reach markets? You know, it's that sort of thing, and it requires thought leadership. You know, I mean, these things don't just happen on their own. So it requires, like Kevin, best practice examples that can be packaged and replicated because they work. It's that sort of thing that is I think really needed now.
Jerry, real quick, because I don't want
Yeah.
to lose this.
Yeah.
Please, let's not lose. I feel like there's not being a connection made to what Doug pointed out about the fear that was illustrated by Kevin, but this is not about Kevin. But I just want to say that same fear that was illustrated, that if there weren't a relationship here, would cause him to never come back. There's a parallel between that kind of fear expressing itself and the silos and the polarization that we have. And I don't want to lose that point. We could pick it up another point, but I will just say, I know what it feels like to walk into a room and have no idea what everybody's talking about. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Ken.
This is called Imagine the Angels of Bread by Martin Espada. This is the year that squatters evict landlords, gazing like admirals from the rail of a roof deck, or levitating hands in praise of steam in the shower. This is the year that shawled refugees deport judges who stare at the floor and their swollen feet as files are stamped with their destination. This is the year that police revolvers, stove hot, blister the fingers of raging cops, and nightsticks splinter in their palms. This is the year that dark-skinned men lynched a century ago return to sip coffee quietly with apologizing defendants of their executioners. This is the year that those who swim the borders undertow and shiver in boxcars are greeted with trumpets and drums at the first railroad crossing on the other side. This is the year that the hands pulling tomatoes from the vine uproot the deed to the earth that sprouts the vine, and the hands canning the tomatoes are named in the will that owns the bedlam of the cannery. This is the year that the eyes, stinging from the poison that purifies toilets, awaken at last to the sight of a rooster, loud hillside, pilgrimage of immigrant birth. This is the year that cockroaches become extinct, that no doctor finds a roach embedded in the ear of an infant. This is the year the food stamps of adolescent mothers are auctioned like gold doubloons, and no coin is given to buy machetes for the next bouquet of severed heads in coffee plantation country. If the abolition of slave manacles began as a vision of hands without manacles, then this is the year. If the shutdown of extermination camps began as imagination of a land without barbed wire or the crematorium, then this is the year. If every rebellion begins with the idea that the conquerors on horseback are not many-legged gods, that they too drown if plunged in the river, then this is the year. So may every humiliated mouth, teeth like desecrated headstones, fill with the angels of bread.
Wow.
That was heavy.
I dedicate that to the incoming administration.
Nice. Nice.
Sure.
Um,
And to all the rest of us.
yeah. Thank you all. This has been a funky special call. I really appreciate your being here.
Really
And I'll see you I'll see you in a week, some of you in between. Thanks.
Bye.